Okay, let's open in prayer and then we get launched. Father, thank you for this opportunity just to share with each other stuff that's on our various minds, to interact with questions that are out there, ours and those of others whom we may be interacting with. And we would just ask for real clarity of communication this evening and a good time of interaction and of celebration as we conclude Shabbat together. In Yeshua's name.
Amen.
Okay. Because this particular question was sent in by one of our people who...
Well, say hello and what we're doing here, please.
Oh, go ahead.
Hi. Welcome to, what are we calling this?
Stump.
Stump the Stars. It used to be Stump the Rabbis, but that email was already taken. So we have named it Stump the Stars. I'm just going to move this lamp for a minute. Welcome. This is where we attempt to answer various and sundry questions about the scriptures, about Judaism, about Christianity, about any of those topics, or the combination of those topics. Yes?
Yes.
Just sort of in an average way so that people who do not have a high level of theological education can get something out of them. Sometimes we're better at doing that than not. Sometimes we have to use highfalutin theological statements in order to really communicate what's going on. But anyway, having introduced us, I'm Patrice, he's John. We've been doing this for way too many years and should be retired, but I guess we're
At least not yet.
not. No comment.
All right. So, as Patrice said, welcome to Stump the Stars, Jewish style. This question was sent in by someone who is rarely with us in real time because of a major time zone differential. So,
Is he in Hawaii?
yes,
Okay, that's the time zone.
we're talking Hawaii. And because he took the time to send it in, and because the way in which he worded it, he says this is an opportunity for a commercial. So I thought we'd start with that and take advantage of the opportunity for a commercial. Shamelessly, yes. His question is, and then I'll move to the commercial part of that, is I've noticed that quite many Christian scholars and many seminaries lately have taken the teaching of minimalist or minimal facts approach in regard to providing an apologetic of the Messianic faith. Do you know if there are any seminaries or yeshivas left to teach a biblical apologetic with a maximalist approach?
Okay, I have a question.
Yes.
About the question.
Yes.
What do you think he means when he says a minimalist or minimal facts approach? So what is being presented?
My guess from knowing him and from the way in which he's worded this is that what he has observed or thinks he has observed is that in many seminaries the approach to the factual or historical basis of the biblical text is not emphasized, or it is acceptable that perhaps some of the events and statements and facts that are presented in the biblical texts are not necessarily historical in the pure sense of historical, but they may be more literary or perhaps metaphorical. That would be my guess as to where he's coming from. And
and to put that down in everyday parlance. So when you go to those seminaries, hypothetically, you would not have to take anything that involved apologetics. Is that what the issue is?
don't know if you would have to take anything related to apologetics, or the apologetics they present don't necessarily, well, they might say that the gospel writers not only utilize some material that was in fact actual events, the speech of Yeshua, but that they, in part of their preaching and presentation, brought in things that were to fill out the narrative that weren't necessarily historical.
Can you
And
give an example? It's very vague to me.
yeah, I know it's very vague, and I'm
So,
hunting
Sounds
for
more
it.
like an assumption rather than,
Yeah, well, it is
it's an assumption.
in many cases. It is an assumption. Or, for example, since you spoke on this during the high holiday season, the story of Jonah is not really a story of a guy who actually got swallowed by a fish, or usually it's presented as a whale, but that it's just a story that's there to teach God's graciousness to nations beyond Israel, or to show his inclusiveness for others outside of Judaism. Rather than, it was actually about a person by the name of Jonah who actually got swallowed by a fish and then got upchucked by said fish. And the same thing for, as you apply that approach to the
So the
Old
emphasis is more on what do we learn from the story
Yes.
rather than how do we know that it has,
that it actually took place.
yeah.
That is my read as to what he is saying here, and if we have read that wrong, I will find that shortly, because I do owe him a phone call next week, so I will find that.
I just wanted to mention, and it's somewhat related to this, but people may not realize. So when John and I went to school back right after the last dinosaur died out, we went to seminary. And in those times, if you wanted to be the leader of a country, there were many different reasons to go to seminary. It's not just for those people who want to be a pastor or a minister. There, at our particular seminary, there were also people like John and I who were in an MA program, or so that we could go on in scholarly education to get our doctorates. But there were also, and I'm going to say guys, because they were all guys, who were getting a 3-year master's degree called an MDiv. And they were the ones who were headed for a pulpit, for just to get rid of some of my extraneous words. Which is fine. And the vast majority of the people were there to get a Master of Divinity and go on to lead a church. However, these guys, they all needed to take a certain amount of the Greek language and a certain amount of the Hebrew language. So that was a requirement to get your MDiv. And they struggled through Hebrew. They taught it like you were in a medieval seminary, and that your life was going to be full of drudgery and just go home and memorize this stuff. And they always kept up with the Greek in our experience. They enjoy Greek, even though it's a more difficult language. They keep up with the Greek because they find it more practical. And we just talked to a friend of ours, a contemporary of ours, who admitted that to us the other week. But now, evidently, the thing is, you don't have to take Hebrew, and you don't even have to take Greek. You can just take an introduction to biblical languages, which really leaves this person without a basis, hardly for even looking up words in a dictionary. So I guess they decided that I'm being facetious, but they needed 2 more public speaking courses. I think that's what it got exchanged for. Or pastoral, even though they take a lot of courses on the pastoral helping the congregation. Anyway, so that's my nugget to throw in there. But the rest of this, I don't know how they're doing things nowadays.
First, it might be helpful to do a quick definition of the course apologetics, or the term apologetics. Ultimately, these courses in that particular subject matter has to do with answering questions about the biblical faith and or providing evidences, historical and otherwise, for the biblical faith. So that's the nature of this course in this term apologetics. he asks in terms of seminaries still teaching a maximalist approach. In other words, that all of what we find in the biblical text that's presented as historical is in fact truly historical and historically accurate and reliable. And in the courses on apologetics, at least, depending on where you're getting them from, they will provide you with the material that provides the evidence for the reliability of these texts. Now, he asks for names of places. I'm going to miss some, and for those who are in those institutes, I apologize in advance, but the ones that pop into my mind most readily are our own alma mater that's associated with Trinity International University. It's called Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. Their approach is still what this questioner calls maximalist. Another well-known one is Dallas Theological Seminary. There is one, Trinity's in Chicago, that's in Dallas. There's one on the West Coast, the seminary associated with Biola University. I can't remember the exact name of
Talbot.
it. Talbot, thank you. Talbot Seminary. To a large degree, I'm thinking that Gordon Conwell still takes that approach. I'd have to double check this with our academic dean of our yeshiva here. Asbury may. So those are the ones that come to mind. But of course, and then of course, from a particularly Messianic perspective, Talbot Seminary does have the Feinberg School associated with it. Oh, yes, thank you. Denver Theological Seminary also tends to take a maximalist approach. And that's in Denver. So I think that covers quite a few.
Would you say Westminster is one?
Oh, thank you. Yes, Westminster in the Philadelphia area is certainly used to be. Now, what you need to understand about these various institutions, some of them are locked into certain particular theological positions very strongly. For Westminster's one to maybe think of it. It's a very Presbyterian theology that's there. So you need to know in advance what theology is, or within what brand of theology this is, the materials being presented. And then you've got your Messianic institutions. And of course, right at the top of the list is our own Netzer David Yeshiva that's part of St. Petersburg Seminary and Yeshiva. We continue not only to provide a maximalist approach, but also an approach that is thoroughly saturated by the Jewish culture, context, and background of these texts, both as far as understanding them and as far as making a case for them being historically reliable and accurate. I think we did pretty well with that.
Yeah, I mean, do you think you're done with what he asked?
I think for what he asks, yes.
For
what he's asked here, yeah.
And we apologize if we've left anyone off, the list.
Yes. But the one, since it was meant to be a commercial, I'll continue with the commercial and say this. All of our courses are available. I'm sorry, I'm getting light and darkness going on here.
Seminary classes.
All of our seminary and yeshiva classes are available by way of distance learning as well as in person or through virtual venues. I have to say that slowly, so I got that.
Virtual venues.
You like that?
Yeah.
All right. Now, this has gotten us underway, and what we like to do is
We're off like a herd of turtles.
we're off like a herd of turtles. What we like to do is ask those of you who are actually on screen or in person if you've got any questions you'd like us to deal with before we get back to the ones that were sent in for us. Tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick.
It's okay. Some may arise.
Tick tock. Okay, if they arise, we'll get to them. All right. Now, this is interesting because it was sent in on Wednesday.
Okay.
About a person whom I talked about last night during the drash. Now, I'm going to guess that this particular person was reading the text from last week, which does include the mention of this person's name. It's
In
Enoch.
the commentary.
Yeah.
They've mastered the text. They've already gone to the commentary. So
Yes, and it's come from one of our favorite people. But a character by the name of Enoch was in the text in the Parsha, the portion from last week, and I mentioned him as well last night in conjunction with the fact that our text for this Shabbat is Noah, and it says Noah was a righteous person. He was perfect or complete among the people of his generation, and then it defines how those things are worked out. It says because Noah walked with God. And although the other descriptors of Noah are in fact the first time these descriptors are used, walk with God, that's not the first time that that's used in the text. It's used in the text, the closing part of last week's Parsha, our portion for the week that's read in synagogues around the world. And it mentions Enoch. Enoch walked with God, and the text says, and then why don't you read it from there? I think it's like
I was just going to look it up.
5:22 to 24, somewhere in there.
Genesis 5, yes.
How does it translate it?
Well, first of all, it's starting at verse 19. Then Jared lived 800 years after he became father of Enoch, and he had 8 other sons and daughters. So all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. And Enoch lived 65 years and became the father of Methuselah. Then Enoch walked with God 300 years after he became the father of Methuselah and after he had other sons and daughters. 23. So all the days of Enoch were 365 years. 24. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Okay.
He was not, for God took him. In other words, he disappeared. He was gone. Now, the question, now that's a biblical text, and that text has been discussed by the rabbis and others down through the ages. One of those who discussed it was a very significant Jewish commentator and rabbi from 11th century.
11th century, yeah.
11th
I was going
century.
to say Middle Ages.
Yeah.
Late Middle Ages.
His name is Rashi. Commentary from Rashi regarding Enoch was that he lived his length of days and God had taken him. Hence, God had caused him to die before his time. So the wording was different than the others who are mentioned here. Other scripture has Enoch being taken, but not that he died. Okay, the text simply says he was gone or he wasn't.
I don't know where the idea of he was taken before his time. Where does that come from? I don't see it.
See, that's the point. That's part of the ongoing discussion of the text
Oh, I see.
that Rashi is reflecting on.
Okay.
And the only reason I know about this is I happened to look at this in preparation for my mention of Enoch last night, and did read the commentary from Rashi. But as Patrice has already suggested, you don't find God cutting short his life.
That's nowhere stated in this text.
That's the whole point. It's not stated in the text. It's an attempt to understand what the text is trying to communicate. Usually, in a course that we teach called hermeneutics, another commercial for the seminary in yeshiva, one of the texts there is written by a Jewish scholar from Israel. And I love using a text for 3 reasons. Number one, it's short. It's around 100 pages, maybe a little less. The subject matter, it's called Peshat before Drash. In other words, you take the simple meaning of the text before you try to find other explanations for understanding the text. And the third reason I love it is because the author's name, and this is an Israeli scholar, Alan Smith. So, with that being said, the point he makes is the point that Patrice made. If you take the simple meaning of the text, it was not that God caused his life to end prematurely, but in a sense, God graduated him. Now, years and years ago, I did this in looking through some of the numbers, and it wasn't at my initiative. I heard this and then I checked it. If you check the chronology of the biblical text here, according to the biblical chronology, the year that Enoch left the earth was the year that the flood came on the earth. And in that sense, what is the text would be saying in its larger context is God spared Enoch from the flood. So what happened? Well, as some describe him, he was spared death, not that his life was ended. And if he was spared death and he was no longer on the earth, then God took him directly to be with himself. Shocking, 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 shocking not. Because if you remember the story of Elijah, same kind of thing happened to Elijah. Elijah did not die. He just, as the text describes it, in a sense, just disappeared from earth.
Like was translated
Was translated, yeah.
in a different sense that language is
Yes.
translated.
That technical term is translated. So that's the Enoch story as it is understood using the simple meaning of the text.
I'm just going to say this. I know you know this, but I'm just going to sort of hash something through out loud. I guess you're looking up something. So
I think there's a reference to Enoch in Hebrews.
okay. Here's what everyone should always remember. If you're reading the scriptures in English, which we highly recommend that you do that. First of all, I recommend using several different translations because there is no one translation that's a perfect translation. Number two, I recommend that you get a Bible that has very good cross references. What are cross references? Well, it's the boring part in the footnotes where it just has different verses you can look up to see where this phrase is used again in scripture, or to see where a specific word is used again in scripture. And then you yourself can look those up, and that will help you determine, if you have a question, what it means. Here's what you should do last after about 3 other steps. Go look to see what another person said about it. Even if that other person is in the Talmud. Do the work yourself first. Don't immediately go to grab something off the shelf where a person, usually a man, is going to tell you what this means. Because then you fall into a trap that you only know the opinions of someone else. You've got to look at, granted, translations, every single one of them has faults. But it's better than going to another person, like for step 2. And yet I find that's what people normally do. And it's sort of distressing to me. Some of us, maybe you don't personally don't think that you have a good enough background to figure out what something means. But with the helps that are provided to you, there's a ton of things you can look up and be smarter about what this is saying or what it's not saying. And you can be smarter about when you finally do go to a commentary, to pick a commentary that is, once again, not blowing his own trombone, but is dealing with the text honestly, as far as you can determine it. Because there's many, many, many commentaries where they're there to blow their own and not to see what the clear meaning of the text is. The text will sometimes, in your mind, seem to contradict itself. Once again, be patient. Well, that can't be true because over here it says this and over here it says this. Oh no, what am I going to do? And then they run and get a commentary to see what Joe Schmo says, because they have 5 Bible degrees according to the footnotes. People with common sense can get a whole lot out of the scripture, just as it is if you look up other places in scripture that deals with this topic or deals with this one. And so I want to encourage all of you to try that first. It'll stick with you better. You'll remember it better. Instead of, I forgot what he said. Yeah. because it wasn't from you.
Okay,
Okay, got it?
got it. Here's what Hebrews says. Now, first of all, quick background in Hebrews, and I mean a very quick background because we teach a whole course on this. Hebrews, don't know who it was written by. Someone who had connections with the Rabbi Rav Shaul, but was not him. In other words, Rav Shaul did not write this book. There's a good possibility a dude by the name of Apollos did, but there's very strong interconnections of this book with the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it tends to reflect that kind of a thought pattern. And here's what Hebrews says. But Hebrews 11:5, by faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For because he was taken, for before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. Commended as one who pleased God. Why? The text says he walked with God. So what this text is saying is what the plain sense of the text seems to be saying back in Genesis. Because he walked with God, God decided he didn't have to die, and so God took him to be with himself. Okay, I think that's really fairly straightforward from here. Now, because it's in the book of Hebrews, it's quite possible that this understanding is also concurrent with the people related to the Dead Sea Scrolls. But there's another mention of Enoch found after Genesis, and that's in the one that Patrice and I quickly talked about on our drive down here. It's Jude 14. It says, Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about these men, talking about people who were not following God, who followed, as the text says a paragraph earlier, the way of Cain, fell into Balaam's error, destroyed in Korach's rebellion, those kind of people, or the people that helped bring on the flood because of the way they acted. And given that background, it would make sense if Enoch, in some sense, is countering what's going on around him, that God would spare him from the oncoming flood that we talked about last night. Anyhow, and then the text goes on to say, see, the Lord is coming with thousands upon thousands of his holy ones to judge everyone, to convict all the ungodly of their ungodly acts that they have done in their ungodly way, and of all the harsh words ungodly sinners have spoken against him. And Enoch is quoted as saying that. Now, if I had just read you that text, you would not know where it was taken from, and you probably would have guessed one of the more apocalyptic texts of the scriptures was saying that. One of the prophets who was looking into the future, perhaps even into Revelation. But this is a quotation from the book called First Enoch. Now, the version I grabbed happens to be the NIV Study Bible, and it has a very interesting footnote that I do want to read because it helps you better understand the role of these texts, and it has to do with the rest of this question that came in. The questioner says, your mention last Friday night during your drash, not last night, but the week before, the book of Enoch. It brings to mind a few questions I've heard about. Though it is currently a popular topic, there seems to be wide variability on its viability and trustworthiness as a reference, since the topics are not settled in Torah to any reasonable extent. And I'm assuming in this case the questioner is talking about Torah as not just the 5 books of Moses, but then the rest of the Tanakh, the Older Testament. Can you give us a brief synopsis of its content and comment on it, and comment on how seriously we should pay attention to its content?
So this is the book of Enoch, book of First Enoch. So there's more than one.
Yes, there's Second Enoch.
Okay, sorry.
And just to make things, and here comes the questioner whose question we answered at the very beginning of the session.
Too late.
So you're going to have to rewind to get to that. I'm particularly interested in the discussion of angels. Okay. With that as a background for this question related to Enoch, The quotation is from the apocryphal book of Enoch. I'm reading the note now, which purports to have been written by the Enoch of Genesis 5, but actually did not appear until the 1st century BCE. In other words, it preceded Yeshua by decades, perhaps as much as close to 100 years, which is why it could be then quoted in the Newer Testament. The book of Enoch was a well-respected writing in Newer Testament times. That it was not canonical does not mean that it contained no truth, nor does Jude's quotation in the book mean that he considered it inspired. That's as far as I need to, because that very nicely summarizes some of the questions and begins to answer what this questioner asked. Enoch was one of a number of a large number of texts that circulated during the Second Temple period, particularly during the late Second Temple period. Late Second Temple period is that part that corresponds to shortly before Yeshua, through Yeshua's life, and after his death and resurrection to the destruction of the temple. And there had some ongoing ramifications through the end of the 1st century, even though the temple was no longer there. So it covers a time span of perhaps a couple hundred years, maybe a little longer, depending on who's describing this as the late Second Temple period. Enoch was just one of a handful of books. No, a large handful of books from that time period. A small handful of those books ended up in what's called the Apocrypha. We'll get to that in a later question, perhaps. But just this part of the question I want to deal with. So it shed light on the thinking, the discussions, some of the understanding religiously questions people may have had of the late Second Temple period, particularly the Jewish people of late Second Temple period. I did not remember my mentioning the book of Enoch in the drash from the week before, so I don't remember the exact context in which I said that, but usually when I mention the book of Enoch, and particularly First Enoch, my reference is to one of a couple things that's going on in this particular book. This particular book has a strong focus and attention on what's often called the end of days, or the coming messianic age, or the world to come, to use the various.
The apocalypse.
Hence it's called apocalyptic. One of the reasons I mention the book of Enoch very frequently is in the book of Enoch, one of the most primary titles that occurs is Son of Man. And that is significant because in the Gospels, and I say specifically in the Gospels, as I recall, nowhere outside the Gospels in the Newer Testament do you have the phrase Son of Man applied to Yeshua. It's his favorite title for himself. So it's an important title. Most people think that is his way of describing his humanity, whereas Son of God is his way of describing his deity. Usually it's the exact reverse of that, but we don't have time to get into that at this particular point. Its use in First Enoch, in other words, its use in the religious culture and context of the day, was to describe someone who's clearly supernatural. And in fact, it's built on Daniel chapter 7, where this figure, Son of Man, shows up on the scene. And this figure, Son of Man, the Ancient of Days, way of describing God, who sits on the throne, turns over all the kingdoms of the world forever to Son of Man. And he comes riding in, the picture's quite clear, riding in as if he's riding in on the very glory of God. So this is a very supernatural character in Daniel, and it's that aspect that First Enoch picks up. Another part of Enoch, as it deals with messianic imagery in the messianic age, includes some texts that I will quote in the next couple weeks of the Gospels course. So if you want to get this information, you got to get in the Gospels course. That was yet another commercial, but in which the Messiah to come, is described as a lamb, but in two senses of the term lamb. Lamb in the sense of how John the Jew, if you remember, he wasn't a Baptist, how John the Jew described Yeshua as this Passover Lamb of God. But more frequently, it refers to this coming messianic figure as a conquering lamb or a ram. You get some of that kind of imagery in Daniel chapter 2 or 8, I forget which. But it's the same image of the lamb that you have in the book of Revelation, where the lamb is the conquering hero. So those are some of the pictures. You get some very clear parallels to Yeshua in the book of Enoch. And remember, the book of Enoch was written close to a century before Yeshua was born. So that's the impact of the book of Enoch, because it's heavily future oriented. It presents its understanding of what the future, the coming age, is going to look like. And although I don't know all the context of this part of the question, I will suggest that if this is being discussed nowadays prominently or popularly, it has to do with speculation concerning either we are ready to enter the last days or the close of the age, or we're already in it, or something akin to that. So that would be my reading and understanding.
Yeah, I realize that there are realms, especially on TV, with preachers talking openly about Antichrist and mark of the beast and the phrases that we know, at least I know personally, from the 1960s, when we were convinced it was going to happen very soon. And we didn't think we would become old because it was going to happen so soon. So let's not step on that, I don't know what carnival ride you would like to associate with that with. The carousel spinning out of control, or there must be a different one, a Ferris wheel spinning out of control. So for everybody in public ministry who is yelling about things that are mark of the beast and people are the mark of the Antichrist and bringing up all this apocalyptic language, everybody else should just maintain that, yeah, we thought that in the 60s. And they thought it in the 1920s. And our friend who's going to be with the Lord, he told us in class that during World War II, he was a teenager, and in their church, they figured out who the Antichrist was, and they did it using numbers and not numerology, but figuring out by numbers, and they knew who it was, and it was Mussolini. In the 70s, people could prove that it was Henry Kissinger. So please take a step back. Do not listen to these people who are saying these things or leading large groups of people to follow in their opinion. Take a step back and use your brains.
As you were talking, I was also reminded of a question that was asked to me by my class several years ago. It's a number of years ago now. I'm guessing around 10, maybe closer to 12. And the question was actually raised like this: we have heard that because his name is Barack, the former president, Obama, is somehow part of the Antichrist system of the world to come, if not the Antichrist himself. And I had to point out that the name Barak is related to the Hebrew term Baruch, which means what? Baruch atah Adonai?
Blessed.
Blessed. So all kinds of craziness is out there concerning speculation about the future and where we are with respect to the future. As I mentioned in the class this past week, the Gospels class, concerning questions that are somewhat unanswerable The rabbis have a favorite way of answering it, saying, when the Messiah comes, he'll tell us. So that's how those questions get answered. Now, as I was rereading that question, I saw that the questioner was asking about Enoch's perspective on angels. Enoch, as I recall, the only thing I recall about Enoch talking about angels is that he mentions a hierarchy of angels. And the hierarchy included certain, what are they called? Not guardian angels. I'm losing the term. Chief angels.
The archangels?
Thank you, archangels. These are not the angels who guarded the ark that we talked about last night.
No, they're ARCH
Yes.
angels,
Archangels, the head angels. Biblical text,
like an archbishop.
yes. The biblical text mentions two, Michael and Gabriel. The text of First Enoch mentions at least two more, and the only one of those two that pops into mind presently is Uriel. But there is another one that, at least one more, if not two more, that are mentioned there. So it talks about
Raphael,
Thank you.
but not the rest of the Ninja Turtles.
That's right. Thank you. Somebody picked
Thank
up
you.
on that. We
Thank you
appreciate
for
that.
laughing.
Yes, Raphael.
Raphael. Mhm. And there's a couple more, you're right.
And then there is one called Metatron,
He's scary.
who shows up in other forms of literature, but also shows up in the prayer for the extended prayer for the sounding of the shofar on Rosh
Right,
Hashanah.
that's how
Yes.
I remember that name from recently when I chatted with you about it.
Yeah, and often he's described in that particular prayer as the prince of the presence of God's face, or the prince of God's face, or the prince of the presence of God, or something very similar to that. In other words, he becomes far more than an angelic creature. In that prayer, he's actually a supernatural creature, divine creature. But anyhow, so that's what I know about angels from Enoch. What was clear in Enoch and what was clear in the other writings of that period was that there was like I said, hierarchy of angels, and often the terms that were used were principalities and powers. You may be familiar with that term because in Ephesians, and maybe Ephesians and Colossians, the rabbi talks in terms of principalities and powers, talking about the heavenly realms. So that's what's current in that time period. And again, let me take a step back, and that is, as the footnote noted here, just because these are not part of the biblical text does not mean this literature contains no truth. But just because it contains some truth and it is quoted by the biblical text does not mean that it's inspired. You have to evaluate it like the other text of that day to find out what, in fact, holds up and doesn't hold up.
Also, sometimes these books are compiled and sold in bookstores as the lost books of the Bible.
Mhm.
So some people, I'm thinking of my sister, who informed me that, well, there have been books of the Bible that have not been shown to us, so we need to know what they are. I just said, you can go to any library and read them. They are the apocryphal books. And she went, humph. But people who don't know and who are, let's say, pumped up by preaching that they see or hear, or, could be internet, all text. They make assumptions that, things have been kept from us. No, these books, you can read them all day long if you want. It will be confusing. You'll be confused. Depending on which ones you take a liking to and which ones you don't. But you're not uncovering any secrets that people haven't been talking about for the last 2,000 years. Really, it's not a very well-kept secret. And they're not lost. And they were never lost. They were not put in scripture by people who knew better than you.
Yes, definitely want to reemphasize what Patrice just said. These are not lost books. These are not books that somehow we missed out on. These are books that were evaluated by the people of their time and judged to be non-canonical. In other words, they weren't part of what we would consider Bible.
They weren't God-breathed.
God-breathed, no? Yes. So, yeah, that's important to understand. We know what was accepted with, and some of these books found their way into some versions of Orthodox or Protestant, probably Catholic Bibles. Some found their way into what's called the Septuagint, and they're listed specifically under the technical title of Apocrypha. The Apocrypha involves some dozen or so books, Enoch being one of them, and that sort of transitions us into this next question that was actually sent to us back at the end of August that we didn't get a chance to get to.
Oops, we've been busy.
Well, but it was part of two questions, and we did deal with
Yeah.
the first of the two questions. The question was, is it anathema for Jews to study Apocrypha? And then the questioner says, per Sanhedrin. So that's the question. All right, first of all,
Who's the Sanhedrin?
yeah.
And why do we care?
First of all, do you want to talk about that?
No.
Okay. First of all, the Sanhedrin that's being referenced is not the specific Sanhedrin that was in place during the time of Yeshua. The Sanhedrin that's mentioned here is after the time of Yeshua and after the Second Temple's destruction. The Apocrypha are Jewish books. They just didn't become part of the Jewish canon. We know that they didn't because you have a numbering and listing of some of the texts that are part of the Jewish Bible by Josephus, first century of the Common Era. You find them listed as well in one of the books of the Apocrypha called Ecclesiasticus or Ben Sirach. And both Josephus's and Ben Sirach's listings are the same. And they include, depending on how you're counting them, the 22 or the 24 or the 39 books of the Older Testament. Why are the numbers different? It's just different ways of numbering the collection. You count 1st and 2nd Kings as one book or two. You count 1st and 2nd Samuel as one book or two. You count Ezra and Nehemiah as two books or one. 1st and 2nd Chronicles you have as well. You also have what's called the Scroll of the 12. This is the scroll it involves all the prophets that Patrice is teaching about in the course called Minor or Mighty Prophets. So it depends on how you're counting those. Sometimes, Judges and Ruth are considered one text. Jeremiah and Lamentations are considered one text. So that's to give you some examples. But it's the same books, it's just differently numbered. And you find reference to these texts in the Newer Testament, and these are the only ones that are described as Scripture. This quotation from Enoch is described as Scripture that we read from Jude. So that's the nature of the Apocrypha. But as this footnote said, and as I said earlier, this material helps us better understand the religious discussion and thought of the time period of the late Second Temple period. So it's very helpful to study. And because it's helpful to study, Jews study it also. And by the way, Patrice alluded to this, and I need to, as part of this discussion, mention that when you're dealing with these books of the late Second Temple period, there are dozens of books. The ones that found their way into the Septuagint are called Apocrypha. The ones that didn't find their way into the Septuagint are called Pseudepigrapha by and large. And if you want to know how many books there are of those, my recollection at last count is 60-some. And I can double check that count because in my library I have a 2-volume set of Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. And the 2-volume set each volume is about that wide and each volume is about that high. So we're talking about a whole lot of material there. Valuable material for understanding religious discussion in this time period. So it's important to study. Now,
While you were talking, I was looking up the word anathema
thank you.
in my phone. Free dictionary, you get what you pay for. Because I thought it sounded Aramaic, but it's Greek.
Thank you.
So we'd have to do more research, so it was Greek that was taken and not translated, but drawn right in to the Greek text, to the Greek text, and then into the Latin where it was used this Greek word was used in Latin by the church, and so that's where it comes from. But I was just curious, in case you were wondering why I was playing on my phone. I was looking it up in the
I
dictionary.
figured you were Googling something. All right, now, why did the questioner ask about the Sanhedrin? Because, and I could not, in a quick lookup of this question, find out which Sanhedrin,
I was going to say which one,
which Sanhedrin time-wise.
what year?
I'm going to guess it's going to be second century, and the reason I'm guessing second century because there was this edict from the Sanhedrin in the year 117 that spoke out against the study of Greek philosophical literature. My guess is in that context, they might have spoken about the study of other kinds of literature, in this case, what we call the non-canonical books. Why would they stress this? Because we should be ignorant of this? No. If you understand the way in which the rabbis approach these things, often they will say one of two things. One, it is far more important to spend your time studying the biblical texts rather than the non-biblical texts. Why? Because as we would call them, one is inspired, one is not. Second, they are apt to say that until you've mastered the biblical text, you're not ready to study the non-biblical texts. In fact, concerning what is now called the Kabbalistic literature, Zohar, etc., Kabbalah, etc., the rabbi spoke out about that. And they said, until you have mastered not just the scriptures, but the scriptures plus the Talmud, you're not ready to look at Zohar or Kabbalah.
Not until you're age 30.
No,
Oh.
I thought
It's not age 30?
I thought it was 40.
Okay, whatever you say.
But until you've reached a certain
You're
age,
older.
but, and in some versions of it, until you've reached age 70. But the point is, but the specific is until you've mastered Bible plus Talmud. And in case you're wondering about the Talmud, if we were in my office and you were looking at my bookshelf, Jessica is smiling at that because she knows how long this is. On my bookshelf, Talmud, okay, that's off the screen. Is this on the screen? Yeah,
About that long.
about the length of the screen you see, the monitor. That's how many books are in the Talmud, till you've mastered that as well. So that's a somewhat expanded answer to the question of Apocrypha, Enoch, the person, Enoch, the book, and studying the Apocrypha and why or why not. So,
And we still don't know who was talking about Enoch to
oh,
the
nowadays,
uninformed masses. Yeah.
Yeah,
So if anybody has any insight on that, let us know.
yeah. Now, since the days of the internet, this problem has geometrically multiplied, exponentially multiplied, whatever set of terms you want to use. And that problem is all kinds of interesting speculation about all kinds of interesting stuff. And it's only interesting because the person's ignorant of that which he or she is speculating about. And so shares that ignorance or misinformation with others, which then becomes the fodder or the food for further discussion. So I'm going to guess, my suspicion is that much of the discussion concerning Enoch, whether it's the person or first Enoch or second Enoch or third Enoch,
Or all the angel stuff.
and all the angel stuff, is speculation by people who haven't really studied the texts carefully. By the way, what language are they written in? Well, the apocryphal version of the Septuagint is obviously in Greek, but we have Hebrew versions of these same texts found among the Dead Sea Scrolls and in other.
Enoch is found in Hebrew too.
Yes.
Yes, great. That doesn't surprise me. In the Dead Sea Scroll community.
In
That
Sea
doesn't
Scrolls.
surprise me either. They were very big on
All right.
angelic beings.
Another helpful book that I will reference in the course coming up is the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, and it's a compilation. I do notice that it's the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, not the Testament of the 2. The patriarchs are here described not as Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the women who held them up. I think that's in a positive way. It's the children of Jacob. So they knew of all 12 tribes at that time, and each one had a testament. That has some very interesting stuff that sheds some light on some of the gospel texts as well. So we have both Greek and Hebrew of those texts as well. So there we go. Now, ready for this one? And we'll make that the last question.
No, we're making that the last question.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Well,
Unless
you have questions, unless anybody, this is a pause. Does anybody have a question based on what we just talked about or something else that has occurred to you? See, they're very quiet.
okay.
All right.
All I see is smiles and what can I
They
say?
want me to keep talking. Okay.
All right. This one of you who is with us sent this in.
All right. I would like to hear the Jewish perspective of the soul. When we die, where does our soul go? Okay, let's pause right there.
Because there's a second part.
So stop me if I'm wrong on this. But my understanding is we are in churches. You are taught that human beings are body, soul, spirit. 3, correct? Except you can't find a scripture that tells you that. Here's what the scripture tells us. There is an inner person, my thoughts, feelings, attitudes, emotions, that only I see or I hear, or however you want to put that in sensory terms, and the outer person. The outer person is what other people can see. So you can see me, you can talk to me, you can watch me perform things in life, do things, relate to people, various jobs I have, various outward things that I do that a video camera could see. But inside me, the inner me, this may not be coming from there at all. Half the things I do might be a big act. I might be acting. I might be acting happy and putting on a smile, and I am not happy. I might be acting like I'm not angry when I am angry. I might be looking at you and smiling and chatting with you, and in my heart I'm thinking, oh my goodness, please go away. You're rubbing me the wrong way. So in that division between the outer and the inner, that's where you find people are divided. In my own life, every time I've tried to hear people explain the difference between body, soul, and spirit, I'm just going, once you get into the inner, non-visible thing, to me, it was just like talking in circles, and I couldn't see the difference between those two. And so it was very much a relief to me, wouldn't you think, to say that there's just two of me to juggle. There's just two of me to juggle. And I think it is a juggling. There is juggling. All of us are feared of that time when people see what we really think. Because then a lot of us, might not come across, some of us may come across way better than we appear, but I think a lot of us would come across as way less than we appear. And I'm speaking for myself and not for him. But is that fair enough to say? So unless we have that set out at the outset, I don't think we can talk about the rest of it. All right, what's the rest of it? What happens at death in general?
Before you go on.
Okay, I was just going to say in terms of inner and outer.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
In terms of inner and outer, what happens? Well, obviously my inner person is not there to animate my outer person. My outer person will still be there, but I won't be there. Have you ever said that? I say that all the time, at funerals. They're not there anymore. You can't communicate with them. They're not there. They've gone on to wherever they are. And that's much easier to explain when you have inner person and outer person, because it's the inner that animates the outer person. All right, so go ahead.
Okay, now I want to expand this just a little bit because there's some layers here. And some of the layers is the development of has to do with the development of Jewish thought over time and its understanding of what soul is. So I'm going to start back in the Second Temple period and earlier. As Patrice intimated, biblical texts do not separate out the soul from the spirit. In fact, the biblical texts talk about soul when they're talking about what we would call the inner person, as Patrice described it, or the invisible part of us, or however you want to put it. And by the way, I'm taking this directly from the Gospels class this week when we talked about soul and we talked about the difference between immortality of the soul and the resurrection of the person. Biblical, for describing the inward part or the invisible part of us, biblical text includes such terms as soul, spirit, mind, heart, thank you, reins or loins, depending on your English translation, intentions, will, and I've missed at least a couple terms that are used. In other words, if you're now going to try to divide these things into parts, we're made up of what? 10 parts or a dozen parts, not 3 parts, body, soul, and spirit. In the Second Temple period, the person was viewed as a unified person, as a whole person. And although there were invisible and visible dimensions, or inner and outer or external dimensions, it was still a whole person that was in view. Now, as Judaism developed through the centuries, some within Judaism have tended to, how should I put it, put a stronger division between soul and body, between physical and non-physical or metaphysical. Not all within Judaism, but some within Judaism. And so the concept of the soul within Judaism then is what we would call the inner part of the person. But more, in some modern versions, more separated from the body than it was originally viewed during the Second Temple period. Which, and I'm trying to be really careful with that, because that leads into the second question. When we die, where does the soul go? And following up on that, is our body in a holding pattern until the Messiah comes, or are we in heaven with him immediately upon death if we've accepted him? All right. The understanding of immortality of the soul, and the main term that's often used to describe soul in Hebrew nowadays is, I believe, nephesh, but there's another one whose name is just slipping my mind. Nephesh is what we would call, more strictly speaking, a living person, a living thing. So anyhow, where does this nephesh go? And like I said, there is another term that's out there as well, but I can't think of it. When we die, is it somewhere out there in the ether? What exactly happens to it? In a lot of Christian thinking, and by and large, I would say in the seminaries that we attended.
Okay, I don't know what you're going to say.
Yes. The idea was the body is left behind, somehow the soul or the spirit or both move on, and somehow they're with God until they are then reunited at the point of time called the rapture. And I know there's a long outstanding question we have. What about the rapture? From one of you people, we will get to that eventually. So, is there this separation between now and then? Or are we in heaven immediately upon death, if we've accepted him, is the second part of the question. Well, my understanding has come to be the latter, that we are immediately with him when we pass on. And I draw that largely from the first paragraph of 2 Corinthians 5, where the rabbi argues that he does not want to remain unclothed, he wants to be clothed. And he's describing his body as a temple or as a structure or another or sorry, as a temple, as a structure, or clothing, hence that metaphor. And his anticipation is that when he passes from here, he passes into the next stage fully clothed. In other words, embodied. Now, does that mean that we somehow precede, or pardon me, have we somehow been preceded by those who've died already? That's a question that's raised in 1 Thessalonians 4, which is the passage that describes the rapture. And my understanding has come to be, no, we don't, because the text says there we don't, or we aren't preceded. But because God operates outside of time. Are you ready for this? And by the way, I read in the class this past week the Midrash from the 16th century, which already picked up on this, that God is outside of time. And then it goes on to say, therefore, everything is present with him. If everything is present with him, then all events taking place on earth take place at that same point in time. Which means then those who passed on before us, and whenever we pass on, or in fact, I'll use the term, get transformed or raptured, all of that occurs simultaneously in God's mind and in God's calendar. Now, it's difficult for us to understand that because we don't think in those kinds of terms, but there it is.
You didn't mention, I thought for sure you'd mention my favorite one.
Go ahead.
Which is the simplest one. What does Yeshua say
I
to
thought
the
about that.
guy being
Yes.
crucified next to him? What does Yeshua say? Today.
Yeah, thou shalt be with me in paradise.
Yes. And because paradise is mentioned there, another theology is developed that the paradise he was referring to is not heaven itself, but some intermediary state that will be transformed into paradise when Yeshua comes. And therefore, it's that state that this guy next to him found himself in, and then it takes the, I'm going to call it loosely, parable of the rich man and Lazarus, and builds on that as well, where it says, what about my friends who are there? Will someone come to them and speak to them? And that then becomes the framework for a whole theory of paradise. And this is found in Protestant and Christian circles, Catholic circles, in different ways, different frameworks. Does that become then the place where we are until Yeshua returns, in some sense? Now, I saw a hand out there. Jeremiah, were you trying to ask a question there?
Yeah, I think C.S. Lewis tried to get at this in his fictionary tale, The Great Divorce. He seemed like he was trying to get at this idea that it was happening simultaneously. Toward the end of the book, I recall they're standing, I don't know if you call it the throne room or whatever, but they're actually looking at their own lives happening simultaneously across this sort of rainbow Rosen bridge, and I thought it was interesting that it compares to.
Thank you for sharing that. C.S. Lewis gets an awful lot of things right. We don't always understand it. Some of it is hidden within not so much hidden, but it's wrapped up in the tapestry of his literature. Some of it comes out in his more philosophical texts. But yeah, he's got that correct. We have a glimpse of it, in one sense, when people think, my whole life flashed before me. Sometimes that's associated with the moment of death as well in some of the descriptions. Perhaps that gets at it somewhat, but that is the story. All right, I'm going to check off the parts of the question that we've done. There is still another part to this question that you turned in, but we'll save this for another time. I will only mention, this is not a full-blown discussion of this, since I mentioned rapture and since one of you asked about the rapture. Rapture or not? Our answer to that is yes, rapture. But what it is and when is it is a whole complex interaction or discussion. In brief, what it is, it's the time when people are transformed from this life into the next, those who are still alive. And somehow those who have died are part of that package. But if it's all one in time with God, then it all takes place at the same instant in time. And it is sounded in by the blast of the shofar, interestingly enough, in 1 Thessalonians. So that being said, unless you want to add further on that in any way, because it sounded like you had something to say.
No, just that I think Christians in general lack an understanding of what Sheol is. So if you were to ask people during the Older Testament, especially, let's say maybe from David and later, what happens when we die, they would say we go to Sheol. And Sheol, as I'm not putting a great deal of concentrated study on it, I'm just leaning things as I go along. Sheol is found, and it's especially important to understand the book of Jonah, because the book of Jonah alludes very powerfully to Sheol. And so what it says in the text, when Jonah, remember, he's up on land and he gets on the ship. So from dry land to the ship, in those days, you go down. And then then when he was on the ship and the ship is sailing, then he goes down underneath the top deck. And then he goes to sleep, which means in that worldview that you go down to go to sleep. And in where Sheol is physically, supposedly, is under the oceans. So, like we would say, heaven is up in the sky and hell is down below the earth. They would say Sheol is below the oceans, and they see it, I believe, as a waiting point for when the Messiah comes. But it's under, and it's dark. It's dark, and you can't see, and you cannot live life, even as your spirit, if it's your spirit, is there. The living part of you is waiting in Sheol. So I'm just mentioning that because I think 21st century people of especially Christians think that hell was always a thing and everybody believed in it, and if you were punished, you were going to go burn for eternity, and if God loved you and you were blessed, you're going to go to heaven for eternity. But that's not the way that it was seen at all in the Old Testament. And so you're asking me, well, then where did they get this idea of hell? Well, that'd be during the Middle Ages. Are there little verses that you can quote that talk about the fire shall not be quenched? Yeah, they're in Isaiah. But he's not talking about hell. He's talking about what will happen at the end of days. In other words, the burning will go on. The burning of the earth will go on forever in his mind, not individual people will burn for all eternity and never be burned up. So I think all of these things, as John and I have learned down through the years, have to be rethought. We have to be able to look at our beliefs and say, does this stand the test of what I know to be true now as opposed to what I knew to be true 30 years ago? Or is this something I need to take a deep look at and determine what it is I understand at this point? And he and I have both had to do that at various times. And we have met dozens of people who've said those words as we had to rethink everything, all of our assumptions that we had growing up. We've had to rethink those, and we go, yes, and we've had to do it too. I I think in general, that's helping. And otherwise, we're still left with the simple explanations that were given to us, maybe at 5 years old. And if you're a mature adult, you've seen a couple of generations go through their 5-year-old phase, and you think, I do at least, gee, I wish I was at their level because it's so simple for them. And when you get to be at our level, it is complicated. And I'd say that's part of this discussion about soul and spirit and all those things that are tricky and to try to deal with, that these are always worth rethinking to see where we're at this point.
Okay, two things to add. One, thank you, Matt. The term that I was looking for the other term for soul is neshama.
Oh, Nisham.
Second, this concept of Sheol was part of what was connected with the concept of paradise in the Second Temple period. And this is one of the areas that was discussed more frequently in the Second Temple period literature, and some of the thinking concerning that whole state of affairs developed in the Second Temple period literature.
When Yeshua,
Oh, well, thank you. Because it had an Orchadash behind it, I assumed it was you, Matt. So thank you for Virginia for picking up on that.
when
Right.
Yeshua says to the thief, today you will be with me in paradise. What is he saying to the thief? Paradise is where God is. You'll be with God, not you will be in Sheol. Remember, that was the understanding, that people would be, no. And Yeshua says, no, paradise equals not heaven. It equals where God is, wherever that is.
Yeah.
Is that fair enough?
That's fair enough. But again, this is some of the stuff that was being thought about and talked about in the Second Temple period. You see it reflected in the writings of the Newer Testament. You see Rav Shaul's discussion in 2 Corinthians 5 as part of that package, as well as his understanding in 1 Thessalonians 4. Some of that builds on the kind of stuff that's found in books like First Enoch and company. Just to put sort of a exclamation point on what Patrice just said. Today you will be with me in paradise. Two things. Number one, at the very last words that Yeshua, if not the last words, the next to last words he spoke, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. So when Yeshua died, where did he end up? Well, if that prayer was not answered, we're in real trouble. If that prayer was answered, he went directly to be with God, which is that's where this thief would have gone as well. Are you with me on that?
Yeshua promises.
That's what Yeshua promises. Paradise, as it became understood in rabbinic and classical Jewish thought, as the rabbis taught it to us, I don't know how far back this goes. It may go back into the Second Temple period already. Paradise is often viewed as Gan Eden.
Gan Eden. Yeah.
The Garden of Eden. In other words, it's a restoration to things as they were intended to be. So,
But whether, go ahead.
Thank you. That's right. You were going to say about paradise?
No,
You-
I didn't think I was.
Oh, what were you going to say then?
Don't remember.
Don't remember. Okay.
Well, except, are we saying that, because paradise is a Greek word. Is paradise a Hebrew word?
No, I think Matt was talking about the Greek word.
Okay, but paradis, which is orchard,
Uh-huh. Oh, okay.
is a Hebrew word. I think it's Hebrew. So I don't know if those are related at all. Because one of them is a Greek word, one is a Hebrew word. And I guess I would have to do more work
More work on it.
to see. They sound They sound alike, but I don't think that one may come from the other, or maybe they do, but it's not obvious. Because it's two different languages. Well, it's a false cognate. It's a false cognate.
It could very well be that, yeah.
It looks like they should be cognates, but maybe they're not.
Either way, Gan Eden, paradise, restoration to the way God wanted things intentionally. And the book of Isaiah ends with God creating new heavens and a new earth. In other words, that's what we're talking about, all of that. Okay. Any further questions from you? Other than the ones we said we'll answer some other time.
Or if you go to be with the Lord, you should for sure ask him. Have a list of questions all ready for you.
All right. Give us a minute and a half to set up for Havdalah. We'll give you a minute and a half to do the same at your end. And then we'll move on.
Yeah, it's already over there.
Yes.
You could change the camera. It might be easy. No, never mind. Just bring it all over here.
No, because the cord won't reach that.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, no, if you're lighting it, I'm going to put that over near you.
Oh, I'm lighting it.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
And I will. That and I have that. Oh, they're ready. They're apples matches.
I still have like 5 hours for sunset.
Well, by faith, you're going to be seeing into the future. See, it's dark here, so you can enjoy our darkness. Why? I don't get it. We have to shun Jeremiah? Oh. Oh. Because the shun's not out anymore?
Yeah, but it stopped showing.
Stop shunning.
Okay. Oh,
Better
and
you go be anathema.
all right. And
Oh, I don't have it, Shmonty. I have it. It's okay. No, never mind. Don't, I'm not using your
okay.
that Shmonty.
All right. And then I will say, since I may forget by the time we're done, Abdullah, good to see you all. And we'll see you we'll be on regular schedule. We'll see you in 2 weeks at 7 o'clock Eastern time.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Ready?
Yeah, do you want to
Light the candle?
do we need to
Put some piece of paper under there?
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah, plenty of paper.
They didn't do that, did they? These are old matches.
Everybody go get the ones by the candles out front.
Let me try this one.
All right.
Okay, let's all sing a song. We can sing Behold God is my
Yeah, go
salvation. Okay, let's all sing Behold God is my salvation. Like everything is working as planned, shall we? Behold God is my salvation. I will trust and will not be afraid. For the Lord my God is my strength and my song. He also has become my salvation. For the Lord my God is my strength and my song. He also has become my salvation. La 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 La, 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 la. Okay, I'm sorry I pitched that so high. Okay, he should be back by now. So I'll pick it. Behold, God is my salvation. I will trust and will not be afraid. For the Lord, my God, is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. Therefore, with joy will we draw water out of the wells of salvation. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be upon your people. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. In the past, the Jews had light and joy and gladness and honor. So be it with us. I will lift up the cup of salvation and call upon the name of the Lord. Now,
Okay. Ran to turn the AC off, so hopefully that'll shortly diminish the blowing of the candle. All right, now we're going to say the blessing for the cup of salvation, but we're not going to drink from it yet. I've lost it. I've lost the tune. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri hagafen. Amen. Oh, I know why, because we're going to use the other two. Lie, lie, la, 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 lie, 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 la, 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 lie, 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 la, 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 lie, lie, lie. Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei minei besamim borei minei besamim. Amen. Lie, lie, la, 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 lie, lie. La, 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 lie, 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 lie. La, 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 lie, lie, lie. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei ha'esh borei me'orei ha'esh. Amen. La 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 la. Which was, deserving of praise are you, O Lord our God, ruler of the universe, creator of the fruit of the vine. Deserving of praise are you, O Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who creates various kinds of spices. And these are the sweet ones, so we remember, carry with us the sweetness of Shabbat through the days that come. Deserving of praise are you, O Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who creates the light of the fire. And so we looked at the light of the fire to distinguish between light and darkness, as we want to carry the light of Shabbat through along with us through this coming week. Deserving of praise are you, O Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who made a distinction between holy and common, between light and darkness, between Israel and the nations, between the seventh day and the 6 other days of the week. Baruch atah Adonai hamavdil bein kodesh l'kol. Deserving of praise are you, O Lord, who makes a distinction between what is holy and common. And now we drink. Okay, and now we try not to burn ourselves by putting out the fire. And we say, bye-bye, Shabbat.
Shavua Tov. Have a great
And we sing. Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi, Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Agiladi, Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi, Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Agiladi. Imheira Yahvo Aleinu, Imheira Yahvo Aleinu, Immashiach ben David, Immashiach ben David. Lie, 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 lie. Lie, 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 lie. Lie, 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 lie. And again, Shavua Tov. Have a great week. We'll see you Friday night for Shabbat at 7:30, and in 2 weeks for Stump the Stars, Saturday at 7. And thank you all. And
Lahitraot.
Lehitraot.
Lahit the road.
That's it.